A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to all of you. I'm your virtual host, Diksha Rena, and it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome all of you to this eventful morning at TOS Vision 2021, the 6th annual virtual conference of the Telangana Ophthalmological Society. Ladies and gentlemen, to begin with the first session of the day, I would like to invite our chairpersons for the TOS pre-paper session. I welcome our chairperson, Dr. P. Venkatraman, co-chairperson, Dr. Raman Yenagundale, and our moderator, Dr. Sandeep Bachu. I would now hand over to Dr. Sandeep. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Diksha. Good morning, everyone. So today is the first session that is TOS free paper session. The chairperson is Dr. P. Venkatratnam, sir, and co-chaired by Dr. Raman, sir. So we'll be starting with the first presentation. So every presentation is of 6 minutes. So request all the speakers to be confined to that 6 minutes talk, and later we can have a 1 to 2 minutes discussion. So first talk is on comparison of axial length and radius of curvature of cornea in various types of refractive errors by Dr. Billa Anusha. Dr. Anusha, over to you.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, all.
Dr. Billa, I would request you to please share the screen. Perfect.
Good morning, all.
Yeah, good morning. You're audible. Dr. Anusha, go ahead. Just make it full screen and we can start.
Good morning, all. I'm going to present a topic on comparison of axial length and radius of curvature of cornea and various types of refractive errors. Refractive error is found to be the most common cause of treatable blindness after cataract. Light has to be refracted or bent by the cornea lens to the retina in order for us to see. When such a focus is not achieved, refractive error results and the vision is not clear. Myopia, hypermetropia, and astigmatism are common types of refractive errors. Refractive status of eye changes with the increase of age, mostly due to changes in the crystalline lens. Other factors include genetic and environmental influences. Etiology of refractive error cannot be fully understood without the examination of biometric data such as axial length and radius of curvature of cornea and corneal power. My aim of my study is to compare the axial length of the eyeball and radius of curvature of cornea in various types of refractive errors. Materials and methods. A prospective study was conducted on 110 patients in the age group of 5 to 40 years of both genders with defective vision, headache, asinopia, attending the Department of Ophthalmology, KIMS Narketpalli, from October 2020 to April 2021. In each case, patient's name, age, gender, occupation, and address are noted. Each patient underwent aided and unaided distance visual acuity test along with the pinhole improvement, and the near vision was also tested. Refractive error was determined in each patient by cycloplegic and subjective refraction. Anterior segment examination was done in each eye using slit lamp biomicroscopy. Cycloplegic refraction was done after inserting 2% homatropine. Patient has been reviewed after 3 days for subject to verification, and dilated fundus examination of each eye was also done. Axial length was calculated in each eye using A-scan biometry, and the radius of curvature of cornea was calculated by using the Bausch and Lomb keratometry. Exclusion criteria of my study is cases of aphakia, pseudophakia, nuclear sclerosis, and all types of cataracts and posterior segment pathology were excluded. Observation and results. This table is showing the age structure present in the sample. Most of the myopes are seen in 10 to 19 years, and the hypermetropes are seen in 30 to 39 years. This is a chart showing the age structure. Prevalence of various refractive errors in current sample. Emmetropes are 22, myopes are 36, and hypermetropes are 52. Total is number is 110. And this is the prevalence of various refractive error current sample chart. The gender distribution refractive error wise, both the genders, hypermetropia was more common than the male. Myopia compared to the males, females are more affected. Gender distribution in current sample. Comparison of mean axial length of the eye in various types of refractive errors. In emmetropia, for the right eye, it is 22.42 plus or minus 0.12 of standard error. The myopia of less than 3, 22.97. As the grade of myopia increases, axial length increases, that is 27.04 for the greater than 6 diopters. The hypermetropia, it is 21.38 to 21.34. This is the mean axial length of the eyeball, showing the more of axial length in the myopia of greater than 6 diopters. Next, comparison of mean corneal curvature in various types of simple astigmatism. For emmetropia, the corneal curvature is 7.80 for the K1 and 7.82 for the K2 for the right eye. For the left eye, K1 7.81 and the 7.84. The simple myopia, it's 82 to 88. Simple hypermetropia, 7.70 and 7.71 for the right eye. The 7.1 and 7.2 for the left eye. This is the comparison of mean corneal curvature and various types of simple astigmatism. This is the comparison of mean corneal curvature in various types of compound astigmatism. It's a graph showing this. The results of my study is out of 110 patients, 22 are emmetropes and 36 are myopes and 52 are hypermetropes. In this current study, mean axial length range from 22.36 plus or minus 0.12 to 22.42 for emmetropia. For myopics, it is 22.97 to 27.04. For hypermetropic, the mean axial length is 22.09 to 21.68. Discussion. As refractive errors are a major cause of mild to moderate visual impairment in the population. Impairment in the population, knowledge of various refractive errors found to be helpful in planning surgery and public health strategy. In the present study, out of 110 patients, 88 had refractive error with the prevalence of 32.78 and 42.78. Hypermetropia is more than myopia in both genders. The current study mean axial length was 22.42 to 20.36 for myopes, emmetropes. For myopia, 22.97 to 27.04.
Interrupt you, Dr. Anusha. I would request you to please sum up in next 30 seconds.
Yeah, you can sum up and just conclude it.
Conclusion is increase in axial length of eye causes myopia and decrease in the axial length causes hypermetropia. So axial length may depict the refraction many a times, and radius of curvature of cornea is responsible for causing astigmatism. These are my references.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Anusha.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Venkatratnam sir, you have any questions for her?
Bachu, it looks paradoxical because the hypermetropia is more than the myopia.
Exactly. Usually myopics are more common than.
It's one thing I would like.
Raman sir.
Yeah, actually, it is prudent to study along with the axial length and radial curvature. They should have added the corneal thickness. That would have been a good study, in fact.
Yeah.
I think not much added here.
Correct.
Yeah, okay, good luck. Done well.
So we'll go to the next presentation. That is study of early presbyopia in rural population by Dr. Sapmidi Nikita.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. My topic is study of early presbyopia in rural population. The unique ability of the eye to vary the refractive power of lens and focus things at a range of distances is called accommodation. The alteration in the curvature of lens and its anterior movement is considered to be a key factor responsible for change in refraction. Gradual loss of accommodative response resulting from loss of elasticity of lens is presbyopia, which is an irreversible normal physiologic condition that affects all primates and can result from a gradual decline in accommodative amplitude. The aims and objectives of my study are to study the amplitude of accommodation in age group of 35 to 40 years, to study the amplitude of accommodation and its relation to refractive errors, to determine other factors that could affect the accommodative amplitude like gender, smoking, and occupation. Materials and method. The study was conducted in Department of Ophthalmology at Kamini Institute of Medical Sciences from October 2020 to April 2021. It's a cross-sectional type of study, and a statistical analysis association was found using the ANOVA test. Inclusion criteria, age group 35 to 40 years, in emmetropes and patients with refractive errors correctable to visual acuity of 6/6 in both eyes. Exclusion criteria: spherical correction of more than 6 diopters, cylinder correction more than 0.75 diopters, and any other coexisting ocular pathology. A detailed history and clinical examination was done, which included estimation of visual acuity, anterior segment, posterior segment examination, intraocular pressure, objective and subjective refraction, and assessment of amplitude of accommodation using the RAF ruler. Observation and results: a total of 123 patients between the age group of 35 and 40 years were included, out of which there was a high prevalence of presbyopia associated with increasing age. The mean amplitude of accommodation for non-smokers was 3.95, for smokers 3.6. For patients who were involved in near work was 3.71, and those not involved in near work 3.95. It was in females it was 3.7 and males 4.2. In coming to the age-wide distribution, 19 patients were of 35 age group, 15 36, 11 37, 18 were 38, 26 39, and 34 were 40. Total of 49 patients were males and 74 were females. A diffractive error among males: 32.6% were myopes, 53 emmetropes, 14 were hypermetropes, and in females 5.4% were myopes, 75.8 emmetropes, and 18.9% of hypermetropes. Among smokers, non-smokers, out of 123, 12 were smokers and 111 were non-smokers. So 90% were in the non-smokers group, and only 9.8 were in smokers. 13 patients were involved with near work, and 110 were not involved in any near work. Association of amplitude of accommodation with other factors, that is, there was a statistical significant association found where it was found to decrease with increasing age, and the highest was found in age group of 35 to 37, whereas in 38 to 40 it was 7.14. With gender, it was slightly more. In males, it was 4.23 diopters, and in females, it was 3.72. With refractive errors, there was significant result. In myopes, the mean was 5.11, emmetropes 3.93, and hypermetropes 2.75. Associated with smoking, non-smokers had a mean of 3.95, smokers 3.63. With occupation, patients were not involved in near work, it was 3.95, and involved in near work, it was 3.71. There was a slight difference, so statistically there was no significant difference. Coming to discussion, accommodation is the ability of the eye to change the refractive power of the lens to automatically focus on objects at various distances. Changes in accommodation related to changes in the ciliary lens and its capsule. The point at which the accommodation is maximally exerted is called the near point. Amplitude of accommodation is the amount of accommodation exerted to move the focus from far to near point. Donders found that amplitude of accommodation decreases with age, and Borish in his study reported that it decreases more rapidly in women than in men, and it is believed to be associated with physical, psychological, and physiological changes which occur during the menopausal age. There was another study which indicated that onset of presbyopia was more in smoking group when normal growth.
So sorry to interrupt you.
Diksha, actually this presentation is for given them for it's for 6 minutes. So by 4 minutes, we're getting this times up.
Yes, sir, because yesterday we had a dry run and Dr. Santosh had mentioned that there will be 4 minutes for the presentation and 2 minutes for the discussion.
No, but the free paper, there are around 15 presenters. So we have 2 hours, 9 to 11. So
Right, right.
Each we can accommodate 8 minutes. So they're prepared for the 6 minutes. That's the reason you need to, we cannot rush.
Oh, okay, okay.
We can do is we can give 6 minutes for the presenter
Yeah.
and 2 minutes for the discussion.
Otherwise, we can give another 1 minute.
Yeah, another 1 minute we can give.
Surely, surely, surely.
Because we have 2 hours, we can accommodate 8 minutes per presentation.
All right, sure. So, Rupesh ji, if you could set the timer for 5 minutes. 5 minutes, take
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
No, 5
Okay.
minutes would be better.
Okay.
5 minutes
Rupesh
would be
ji, if
better.
you could set the timer for 5 minutes for the next speakers.
Okay, ma'am. Done.
And 1 minute for discussion.
Yeah.
Okay, okay, done.
All right, sir. Back to you, Dr. Nikita. You have 1 more.
So the major factor associated was with the use of tobacco. Conclusion: the amplitude of accommodation declines with age. There was a statistical difference found between males and females, where the amplitude of accommodation was found low among females, and the mean amplitude of accommodation was found to be highest for myopes, followed by emmetropes and hypermetropes. There was no significant change found in amplitude of accommodation between smokers and non-smokers. References.
Thank you, Dr. Nikita. Sir Venkatratnam, sir, any questions for her?
Sure. Yes, sir. Welcome, sir.
Ratnam, sir. Or Raman, sir, you have any questions for her?
Yeah, from my side, one question is, see, mainly you focused on smokers and non-smokers. Now. And in the heading, it is the study mentioned about the rural population. So anything, any study, I mean, any factors taken to consideration about in the rural area, more number of smokers are there when you describe the demographic characteristics. I think that point, that area is not focused. But Doctor?
Venkatratnam, sir, any questions for her?
There is nothing significant in this study. I don't think anything significant outcome in this study.
Yes, sir. And actually, she mainly focused on the smokers and the non-smokers. But in the heading, the rural area.
Yeah.
Rural area presbyopia. I mean, there was any study conducted in the population who have participated in the study. Or from the rural area, or more number of smokers are there. I mean, that part of the thing, should have been thrown light actually.
So, shall we take, I mean, that smokers has more probability of having this? Smokers.
Yeah.
Is it?
But only the study sample is very less to conclude that statement.
What does she conclude? What does she conclude is?
Dr. Nikita,
there was no significant difference, sir, because there were more of non-smokers.
Yeah, that is what. No, that is not established. No, I mean, actually, you should have included that. I mean, in the rural area, are there the more number of smokers are there? Or that is missing? Okay, anyway, it's good.
Yeah.
Nice.
Okay.
So we'll go to the next presentation. That is study of evaluation of dry eye status in diabetes mellitus by Dr. Lakshmi Vanya. Dr. Lakshmi, over to you. You can start.
Good morning, all. My study was to evaluate the dry eye status in diabetes mellitus. Diabetes mellitus is a group of metabolic disorders characterized by hyperglycemia, resulting in defects in insulin secretion, insulin action, or both. It affects millions of people all over the world. It is associated with a number of ocular complications, which can lead even to blindness. Complications like diabetic retinopathy, neovascular glaucoma, cataract, refractory deviations, ptosis, palsy of the oculomotor nerve, and ocular surface complications, including tear film dysfunction, are the typical ocular symptoms, ocular complications seen in diabetic patients. Now, coming to dry eye, it is a multifactorial disease of the ocular surface characterized by a loss of homeostasis of the tear film and accompanied by ocular symptoms in which the tear film instability and hyperosmolarity, ocular surface inflammation and damage, and neurosensory abnormalities play etiological roles. Dry eye syndrome is frequently encountered in patients of diabetes mellitus. Diabetes causes epithelial barrier dysfunction, which subsequently leads to corneal complications and then lacrimal function unit dysfunction. The hyperglycemia initiates an inflammatory cascade that generates innate and adaptive immune responses of the lacrimal functional unit. In diabetic patients with polyneuropathy, impaired corneal neurons and reduced corneal sensitivity is observed. The aims and objectives of my study were to study the prevalence of dry eye in diabetes mellitus and to evaluate the ocular risk factors relevant to dry eyes. It was a hospital-based cross-sectional clinical study consisting of 75 diabetic patients who presented to the outpatient department of ophthalmology, Pratima Institute of Medical Sciences between the month of July 2018 to June 2020. All patients of either sex of all age groups diagnosed to have diabetes mellitus of any duration were included in the study. The exclusion criteria is as follows: patients who have had undergone ocular surgeries in the past, patients with systemic diseases and local ocular disease or surface abnormalities as assessed by history and clinical examination other than diabetes mellitus, which are known to cause dry eyes or ocular surface abnormalities, patients on local or systemic medications which are known to cause dry eyes or ocular surface disorders, and patients who were chronic contact lens wearers were excluded from the study. These are the results of my study. On evaluation, 10.7% of the cases were found to have type 1 diabetes, whereas the other 89.3% had type 2 diabetes. On examination, eyelids were normal in 97.3% of the cases, whereas the rest 2.7% of the cases had blepharitis. And low tier meniscus height was present in 29.3% of the cases, and 70.7% had normal tier meniscus height. Conjunctiva was congested in 66.7% of the cases. It appeared dry in 34.7% of the cases and normal in 58.7% of the cases. And on evaluation of the cornea, 24% of the eyes had superficial punctate keratitis, while 2.7% had filamentary keratitis and 73.3% had normal cornea. The corneal sensations were reduced in 32% of the cases, and it was found to be normal in 68% of the cases. The mean tear breakup time in right eye was 21.85 seconds and 21.87 seconds in left eye. Mean Schimmer's test in right eye was 24.04 mm and 24.09 mm in left eye at the end of 5 minutes. The study has shown that about 9.3% of the patients had mild dry eye, 10.7% had moderate dry eye, whereas 9.3% of the cases had severe dry eye. And to conclude my study, diabetes and dry eyes appear to be a common association. Predominantly milder grade of dry eye and moderate form was seen in type 2 diabetes patients. Higher prevalence was observed in those above 50 years of age in type 2 diabetes. Higher prevalence of asymptomatic tear film instability was noted in type 2 patients. Corneal hypoesthesia was also seen associated with dry eyes. Reduction in the modifiable risk factors of dry eye is essential to reduce its prevalence. And superficial punctate keratitis was the commonest corneal pathology in type 2 dry eye. Type 2 diabetic dry eye. Examination for dry eye should be an integral part of the assessment of diabetic dry eye, so as for early intervention and management. Thank you for your patient listening.
Thank you, Dr. Lakshmi, for the nice presentation.
Thanks.
Ratnam sir, you have any questions for her? Sir, you have to unmute your. Sir, you have to unmute.
It's okay, boss. It's okay. There is a common association anyway in the diabetes and
Dr. Raman sir. Sir, we are unable to hear. The voice is getting echoed.
Screen better.
Ratnam sir, you have any questions for her?
No questions, please. From my side, there is no questions.
Raman sir. I think it is an established fact that dry eye syndrome is very common in diabetes patients.
Yes,
But
sir.
So there's an established fact that dry eye syndrome is very common. Can you hear my voice?
Yes, Dr. Sandeep, we can hear you.
Yeah, because there is a kind of resound echo is coming in between when we are.
It's better now.
Yeah, so whatever she said is, already established fact. So we'll go to the next presentation by Dr. Mahesh Gaud. So he would be presenting on comparative study of pterygium excision with conjunctival autograft and amniotic membrane graft. Over to you, Dr. Mahesh.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning. You can start share your screen and present.
Can you see my slides, sir?
No, you have to share.
Good morning, sir, and good morning, ma'am. I'm here to present a comparative study of pterygium excision using conjunctival autograft and amniotic membrane grafts. Introduction. Pterygium is a triangular fibrovascular subepithelial ingrowth of a degenerative bulbar conjunctival tissue over the limbus onto the cornea, which may be progressive, stationary, or atrophic. Risk factors include hot, dry, climatic regions, outdoor workers exposed to sunlight, and those working in the settings of highly reflective surfaces. Despite the multifactorial pathogenesis, surgery is the mainstay of treatment of pterygium. Primary concern in pterygium surgery is the recurrence. Recurrence is defined as the regrowth of fibrovascular tissue across the limbus onto the cornea. Pterygium excision alone is referred to as a bed sclera excision if no additional measures are performed. The recurrence rate of bed sclera excision alone is unacceptably high, which may be up to 80% when compared with the other modalities of treatment. A bed sclera excision alone is no longer recommended. For treatment of pterygium excision is often combined with various adjunctive measures to prevent the recurrence. These include adjunctive medical methods, beta irradiation, surgical methods. Adjunctive medical methods include mitomycin C, which is the most commonly used method. It can be used intraoperatively as well as postoperatively. Surgical options available for pterygium excision are conjunctival autograft, limbal conjunctival transplant, conjunctival rotation autograft, amniotic membrane graft, cultivated conjunctival transplant, mucous membrane grafting. Many authors have reported that amniotic membrane graft is a viable alternative to the conjunctival autograft in reducing the recurrences after pterygium excision. The possible mechanisms by amniotic membrane includes the promotion of conjunctival epithelium, inhibition of the inflammation by the inhibiting chemokine expression by the fibroblasts, and interleukin-1 expression by the epithelial cells. And it also inhibits the neovascularization by inhibiting the vascular endothelial cell growth. Aim of my study is to compare the rate of recurrences in pterygium surgery after using the conjunctival autograft and amniotic membrane graft. Materials and method. The present study is a comparative randomized prospective study was conducted in the Department of Ophthalmology in Pratima Institute of Medical Sciences, Karimnagar. Inclusion criteria: 50 eyes of 50 patients who presented with primary pterygium during the study period. Exclusion criteria: patients with ocular surface abnormalities other than primary pterygia are excluded. Ocular adnexal infections, glaucoma, collagen vascular diseases, and extensive primary pterygia. That means encroaching onto the pupil or beyond the pupil, and chemical and thermal injuries were excluded from the study. Technique: under aseptic conditions after peribulbar anesthesia and excising the pterygium, the free graft of a similar size of the exposed area was obtained from the superior temporal bulbar conjunctiva. This is for conjunctival autograft patients. And amniotic membrane graft, which is commercially available. Amniotic membrane is sterilized by gamma irradiation and was cut into same size as the defect. And both the grafts were secured, flattened, approximated to the recipient episcleral tissue by 4 to 6 interrupted sutures with a 10-0 nylon sutures. Patients were followed up postoperatively on day 1 and first week, 4th week, 6th week, and 6 months. Recurrence of pterygium and other postoperative complications were noted. Results at the 6 weeks and 6 months were used for the analysis of the results include in the study. The gender, age distribution, size of the pterygia were not statistically different between two groups. Conjunctival autograft, in conjunctival autograft group, one patient had recurrence at 6 weeks and which progressed over 6 months. In amniotic membrane group, 3 patients had progressed over 6 months. Amniotic membrane graft has slightly higher recurrence rate than the conjunctival autograft group, which may be not so much significant. A p-value is 0.0692, which is higher than 0.05. This is a table showing the results. This is a bar diagram showing the results. Discussion: as report vary greatly between two groups. Eliminating the variability is eliminated as we followed the same technique was carried out through by the same surgeon throughout the study. And our results confirm that the conjunctival autograft achieves the best results, and primary outcome measure was the recurrence seen in 1 in 25 in conjunctival autograft and 3 in 25 in amniotic membrane graft group. Operative complications includes other operative complications are injury to the medial rectus, excessive bleeding, buttonholing of the conjunctival graft, perforation of the globe with a suture needle, recurrence. And common other complications includes like a suture.
Dr. Mahesh, you can come up and just conclude.
Yes, sir. Amniotic membrane graft can be considered as a first choice in case of extensive teresia, and those might who like to preserve the bulbar conjunctiva for prospective glaucoma filtration surgeries. These are my references. Thank you, sir.
So thank you, Dr. Mahesh. Raman sir, any questions for him?
Yeah,
Ramesh,
Mahesh,
Yes, sir.
yeah, which you like to prefer? The conjunctival autograft or the amniotic membrane graft at the end of your, your study?
Conjunctival autograft is
your-
best, sir.
Why?
It will have a limbal stem cells, so that's why.
Okay. Then, did you use a suture material or any other methodology?
We can use piperine glue or synthetic glues also.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
That's okay. Good.
Thank you, sir.
Ratnam, you had any questions for this?
Ramesh, what you used to suture that? What is the material you use?
N0 nylon, sir.
Okay. Why don't you
Yes.
try with the real seal?
Piperine glue.
Real seal adhesive. Adhesive you can try. You can try adhesive also. You can
Yes, sir.
try,
Yes, sir.
you can try tucking the conjunctiva into the edges of the already existing donor area.
Yes, sir.
Recipient area you can tuck it.
Yes, sir.
So that is also one methodology. Okay, good.
Thank you, sir.
It's always better to have a conjunctival autograft rather than this amniotic membrane graft because of the, as you
Yes.
said, the limbal cells are included in it, and it
Yes,
will
sir.
give protection further for the recurrence. Good.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
So, Dr. Mahesh, the which suture material you have used, nylon or Vicryl?
Nylon, sir. 10-0 nylon.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Mahesh. So next
Thank
presenter
you,
is Dr. Syed Imran. So he would be presenting on surgically induced astigmatism in straight versus curved incision in small incision cataract surgery. Over to you, Dr. Syed Imran.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Syed Imran. My topic is regarding surgically induced astigmatism in straight versus curved incision in small incision cataract surgery. Introduction: any opacity in the lens or its capsule, whether developmental is required, is called cataract. It is one of the major single cause of curable blindness. Cataract surgery has undergone repair in recent years, but the occurrence of the post-operative astigmatism is a major hurdle. The surgically induced astigmatism occurs due to scarring as a result of wound healing at the incision sites. Issues for consideration with any surgical cataract procedure are incision, length, configuration, depth, and complex phenomena of the wound healing. The incision is considered to be the most important step of the operation since it affects the ocular integrity and integrity. Most surgical induced astigmatism is due to changes in the corneal curvature. Present study was done at KIMS Narketpalli to document changes in surgically induced astigmatism occurring after cataract extraction in manual sutureless small incision cataract surgery in straight incision and curved incision. The study was taken under correlation between pre and post-operative astigmatism in straight versus curved incision and the relationship of post-operative astigmatism with the duration of the post-operative period. The present study was carried out Department of Ophthalmology from October 2020 to 21. 146 patients were included in the study, and the patients were selected from the OP batch. Evaluation of the patient was done accordingly. Keratometry was done for all the patients pre and post-operatively. They were subdivided into two groups. Group A consists of small incision cataract surgery with curved incision 73 patients. Group B small incision cataract surgery with straight incision of 73 patients. The inclusion criteria are patients presenting with uncomplicated immature cataract, mature cataract, and hypermature cataract, and the patients who are willing for follow-up. Exclusion criteria with the patients presenting with lens-induced glaucoma, existing cornea scar, limbal scar, coexisting diabetic or hypertensive retinopathy, coexisting pterygium, or any previous history of ocular injuries. Operative procedure, all the surgeries were done under peripheral anesthesia. Incision site was superior in both groups. In group A, a 6 mm 3 planar scleral incision from 1.5 mm from the limbus was made with 15 mm bar Parker plate. In case of group B, a cord incision was given at 6 mm in length at center point of incision being 1.5 mm from the limbus. A single piece intraocular lens of 6 mm optic size and 12.5 mm total size was implanted in capsular bag. Patients were examined on days 1, 7th day, 28 days, and 90 days. Keratometry reading was recorded on each visit. Surgically induced astigmatism was calculated using surgically induced astigmatism calculator. Preoperative and postoperative day 90 keratometry readings were used for final analysis. These are the type of incision and the number of placements. These are the gender distribution. These are the laterality of the right eye or left eye. In coming to preoperative visual acuity, most of the patients are up to 47% of the patients were with C of 3, 43 meters in curved incision. In case of straight incision, about 53% patients. Coming to postoperative visual acuity, on day 1, in case of curved incision, 45% of the patient recorded 6/12 to 6/6. In case of day at the day of day 90, 96% patients in curved incision recorded 6/12 to 6/6. Coming to straight incision, 16% of the patients on day 1 in straight incision recorded 6/12 to 6/6. Only 84% of the patients were recorded at day 90. Range of surgical induced astigmatism is 1.5, 1.25 to 1.5 diopters. In case of cord incision, 49%. In case of straight incision, it is 43%. These are the comparison of straight surgical induced astigmatism on day 1. These are the K values, vertical meridian. About 1.80 diopter difference in case of cord incision, and in case of straight incision, about 3 diopters difference or 3 diopters difference are present comparing to day 1 and day 90. Coming to discussion, in group A, a majority of patients, in group A, that is cord incision, majority of patients are surgically induced astigmatism in the range of 0.75 to 1 diopters. In case of straight incision, majority of the patients has surgically induced astigmatism in the range of 1.25 to 1.5 diopters. Coming to straight incision, on day 1, 46% of the patients in case of curved incision presented with 6/36 and 6/18. By day 90, 96% of the patients has visual acuity up to 6/12 to 6/6. In case of straight incision, on day 1, 16% of the patient had 6/24 to 6/6. On day 90, 84% of the patients has 6/12 to 6/6. Coming to conclusion, in group A, the mean surgical induced astigmatism was 0.83 plus or minus 0.53 diopters. In group B, straight incision, the mean surgical induced astigmatism was 1.37 plus or minus 0.92 diopters post-operatively after 90 days. In the present study, the visual rehabilitation was similar in both groups. We observed there is a flattening of the meridian in which the incision was made. In conclusion, the cord incision is evidently better than the straight incision in minimizing surgically induced astigmatism. These are my references. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Imran. So, Venkatratnam sir, you have any questions for Dr.
Nothing much. We can go ahead.
Yeah. Dr. Raman sir, you have any questions?
Yeah, my question is that any length is taken into consideration?
No, sir. I just took the incision type of the incision and the post-operative period. I have compared it.
No, actually, when you
each 6 mm length incision was taken in both the curved and straight incision.
Okay. So actually, that length, that length matters a lot. In fact.
Yes. Thanks.
So, thank you, Dr. Imran.
Thank you.
Next presentation is by Dr. Harshita Reddy. So she is going to present on a clinical study of posterior capsular opacification based on the design of the intraocular lens. So Dr. Harshita, over to you.
My topic for presentation is a clinical study of posterior capsular opacification based on the design of IOL. Coming to the introduction, cataract surgery is the most common, well-established ophthalmological surgical procedure in the world. This procedure of extracapillary extraction of natural opaque lens fibers and implantation of intraocular lens, which restores good vision. However, posterior capsular opacification, which is also known as secondary cataract, is a common long-term complication of modern cataract surgery. The first IOL implantation was performed by Sir Harold Ridley in 1949. Since that time, technology has undergone a wide variety of improvements that has reduced PCO but didn't eliminate it. Decreased visual acuity induced by PCO is reported to occur in 20 to 40% of patients 2 to 5 years after surgery. The causes of PCO are multifactorial. Cells having the potential to produce significant opacification are the cuboidal anterior epithelial cells and the epithelial cells at the equatorial curve that has significant mitotic activity. The opacification usually takes one of the two morphological forms. One form consists of capsular pearls, which can consist of cluster of swollen opacified epithelial pearls or clusters of posteriorly migrated equatorial epithelial cells. It is probable that both the lens epithelial cells types can contribute to fibrous form of opacification. Anterior epithelial cells are probably important in the pathogenesis of fibrous PCO. Release of inflammatory mediators and complement activation may also stimulate the proliferation of cells. It is found that PCO occurs 10 times more frequently in pseudoexfoliation syndrome. Coming to the aims and objectives, the aim of my study is like finding the incidence of PCO after cataract extraction and PCO implantation in patients attending the outpatient department of ophthalmology in Mamta Medical College. Objectives to study the incidence of posterior capsular opacification in patients implanted with 360 degrees square-edged polymethyl methacrylate posterior chamber PCI IOL after cataract surgery. Eligibility criteria for my patient selection was patient of age between 40 and 80 years, patient with senile cataract irrespective of grade and type of cataract. Exclusion criteria are patient age less than 40 years and greater than 80 years of age, patient with cardiac and serious illness, glaucoma patients, patients with pseudo-exfoliation, traumatic cataract, uveitis, complicated cataract, as well as diabetic retinopathy. A 360 degrees square edge single piece PMMA PCIOL with accurate dioptric power is selected for implantation. Coming to the observation results, our patients were followed completely for a period of 1 year. Of the total 50 patients, 3 patients developed clinically significant PCO in the central visual axis, obscuring the fundus details, in which 2 cases were Elsham pearl type and 1 type was fibrous membrane type. The incidence of PCO is very much reduced in our patients with square edge PMMA IOL implantation when compared to the development of PCO with round edge PMMA IOL. Out of 100 patients studied with round edge PCIOL, 15 cases developed PCO, which contributed to 15% of when compared to 6% with square edge IOL. These are the comparisons with different types, different distribution of different types of cataracts. And post-op complications were corneal edema and iritis. Total number of fibrous membranous opacities were 1 and chill pearls were 2. This was the post-op visual outcome, and final outcome was of 6 was attending total 50 patients. Coming to the discussion, in meta-analysis of published articles on PCO incidence was 11.8% at 1 year and 20.7% at 3 years and 28.5% at 5 years. Studies that were done comparing IOL materials found the lowest PCO rates with acrylic IOL with sharp optic edge. Experimental studies by Nishi and co-authors attributing the PCO inhibiting effect of IOLs to the barrier effect of the truncated edges rather than characteristics of the lens material. Our clinical study attempted to determine whether a square-edge PMMA IOL reduces the incidence of PCO. These are the IOL-related factors or surgical factors which are important for the prevention of PCO. These are surgical factors or hydrodissection with enhanced cortical cleanup, which will decrease the proliferation as well as the regression of the epithelial cells. And coming to the encapsular bag fixation, encapsular edge, which edge on the IOL. And coming to the IOL related factors, it is IOL biocompatibility, maximum IOL optic posterior capsular contact, and IOL optic symmetry where a truncated edge will reduce the formation of PCO. Coming to the treatment of posterior capsular opacification is by ND-YAG laser. Hemorrhage is one of the most significant cause of clinical PCO. and intraocular lens with at least one edge of sharp edge bend will reduce this PCO formation, sir. Apparent surface modification is also known to reduce PCO formation. One piece PMM are also superior to the three piece PMM IOL, sir. And angular haptics, 6-degree angulation will prevent the posterior migration of the lens epithelial cells. Hence, in conclusion, 360-degree square edge optic play an important role in prevention of posterior capsular press. These are my references.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Harshita. Ratnam sir, you have any questions for Dr. Harshita?
Okay, it's okay. Yeah, she did a reasonably good the time.
Raman sir, you have any questions for her?
Yeah, we can go ahead with the other presentation.
Yeah.
It's okay, presentation.
So the next presenter is Dr. Bharati. He would be presenting on correlation of intraocular pressure measurement by Goldman applanation tonometer and central corneal thickness. Dr. Bharati Sangapalli, over to you.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning. You can start now.
My study is on correlation of the intraocular pressure measurement by Goldman applanation tonometer and central corneal thickness. Measurement of intraocular pressure is one of the essential and routine examinations in every ophthalmology clinic. For this purpose, Goldman applanation tonometer is considered to be gold standard. Central corneal thickness is known to affect the accuracy of intraocular pressure measurements by applanation tonometry. In this study, I evaluated the influence of central corneal thickness on intraocular pressure measurement made with the Goldman applanation tonometer in normal healthy individuals. Aims and objective is to evaluate the relationship of central corneal thickness with intraocular pressure in normal individuals. Materials and methods. This is a prospective cross-sectional study of 250 eyes of 125 individuals who had come for routine ophthalmic examination. Intraocular pressure was measured with Goldman applanation tonometer and central corneal thickness was measured with anterior segment OCT. Inclusion criteria: healthy individuals with central corneal thickness of any range and intraocular pressure within normal range with no upper age limit were included. Intraocular pressure was recorded from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. Informed consent taken from every patient for measurement. Exclusion criteria: patients with glaucoma in one or both eyes, eyes with any corneal disorder like opaque or disfigured cornea, corneal ulcer, corneal inflammation, corneal dystrophy, corneal degeneration, keratoconus, and large pterygium were excluded. Eyes with history of any other ocular disease or surgery were excluded. Patients who are not cooperative were excluded. Method of measuring IOP. Goldman applanation tonometer was mounted on the end of the lever hinged on the slit lamp. The patient's head and microscope were positioned. A drop of lignocaine 4% was instilled into the lower conjunctival cul-de-sac and fluorescent impregnated paper strip was touched to the teophorum. The tonometer biprism was brought into gentle contact with the apex of the cornea. When the contact with eye had been established, the semicircular patterns were observed through the slit lamp. Slit lamp was then raised or lowered until the two semicircles were equal in size and tension dial was adjusted so that the inner edge of the upper and lower semicircles are aligned. Ocular pulsations create excursions of the semicircular tear meniscus and the pressure is read as the median over which the arcs glide. A reading was taken from the graduated dial. This reading was multiplied by 10 to obtain IOP in mmHg. Measurement of CCT. Anti-segment OCT uses two scanning beams of light that are reflected off an ocular surface and then detected and compared to a reference beam to create a cross-sectional image. Results. This is the gender distribution, mean central corneal thickness and mean IOP. The mean overall right eye central corneal thickness of 125 patients was 531.43 with the standard deviation of 37.50 and the mean left eye central corneal thickness was 531.58 with the standard deviation of 36.12. The mean right eye Intraocular pressure was 15.34 with a standard deviation of 3.04. And the mean IOP of left eye was 15.36 with standard deviation of 2.99. This is the relationship between CCT and IOP. As the CCT was 434.82, the mean IOP was 11.25, and at 552.73, the mean IOP was 16.17. As the central corneal thickness kept increasing, the IOP kept increasing. Here we can see the line diagram showing the increase in the IOP as the corneal thickness increases. Conclusion, central corneal thickness was clinically significantly correlated with intraocular pressure. A thick cornea leads to an overestimation of IOP. A thin cornea leads to underestimation of IOP. No significant difference in central corneal thickness and intraocular pressure was found between the right and left eyes or between male and female subjects. These are my references. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Venkatratnam sir, you have any questions to Dr. Bharati?
No, she told only, I mean, a linear relationship with the pressure and corneal thickness. Does you know any equations, Amma? Any formula you know for this? Any formula?
Dr. Bharati? Can you hear Dr. Bharati?
Yes, sir. Formula for
relation of corneal thickness and intraocular pressure. What is the South Indian average of the central corneal thickness? South Indian average.
520 to 550 microns.
520 to
550 microns.
Okay. Okay. Is there any relation? You know any formula? How you know that?
P is equal to F by A. Invert.
No, that is inverse fixed law. I'm asking about relation. Okay. Bachu, go ahead.
Okay. So Raman sir, do you have any questions to Dr. Bharati?
Yeah, no problem. Yes,
okay. So then we'll go ahead with the next talk. Thank you, Dr. Bharati. So the next talk is by Dr. Mohammad Ilyas Gori. He would be presenting on choroidal atrophy in a vitamin D deficient patient, a case report.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Sir, I can't share. Good morning, everyone. Today, I will be presenting a case report. It's on choroidal atrophy in a vitamin D deficient patient. So vitamin D is a secosteroid hormone. It is found in two forms in the biological system. The inactive form is 25-OH2-D3 and the active form is 125-OH2-D3. So vitamin D in its active form regulates gene expression in target cells and tissue using both genomic and non-genomic mechanisms. And it modulates inflammation, angiogenesis, oxidative stress, and fibrosis. Vitamin D receptors and some enzymes related with vitamin D metabolism and pathways have been found in retina and choroid. So various studies have suggested the potential role of vitamin D in the functional and anatomical properties in the retina and its pathological mechanisms in some retinal diseases. So diabetic retinopathy, age-related macular degeneration, and optic neuritis are some of the diseases that have been reported to be associated with vitamin D deficiency. So changes in choroid thickness in both adult and pediatric vitamin D deficient patients have also been reported by Onchul and others, Burrell and others, and Eidemir and others. So here we report a case of unilateral choroidal atrophy in a vitamin D deficient patient not affecting the vision. So a 12-year-old female presented to the orthopedics OPD with complaints of limp while walking since 4 to 5 months. She also had headache, vague pain in her thighs and legs, and was unable to get up from the ground without support. There was no history of trauma, and on examination there were no angular abnormalities. X-ray showed classic signs of vitamin D deficiency. Lab investigations, the blood picture was completely normal. While vitamin D levels are severe deficiency, the vitamin D levels were less than 3, while alkaline phosphatase levels were also highly elevated. So she was diagnosed as having vitamin D deficiency rickets and was later referred to our ophthalmology OPD to rule out any refractive error causing her headache. So a complete ophthalmic examination was done. Her best corrected visual acuity was 6/6. IOP was 14 mm Hg in right eye and 12 mm Hg in left eye. So color vision was normal. We initially thought since she is vitamin D deficient, she might be having dry eyes. So we tested her with Sherman's test and it was near to normal. The anterior segment was within normal limits. Coming to the posterior segment, fundus, the right eye was within normal limits, while the left eye, we saw a chorioretinal atrophic patch about 3 disc diameters in size, which was above the superotemporal arcade. And there were no other inflammatory, degenerative, or satellite lesions. So this is a left eye fundus photo showing a chorioretinal atrophic patch just above the superotemporal arcade. We later did a SDOCT with EDI of the left eye fundus. Retinal and choroid thickness were measured at the site of atrophic patch and fovea. And at the site of atrophic patch, the choroid thickness was 61 microns and retinal thickness was 90 microns, while the central macular thickness was 220 microns and subfoveal choroidal thickness was 135 microns. So the other causes of chorioretinal atrophy were ruled out. Torch infection, there was negative serology. Posterior uveitis was not there as there were no other symptoms. A hereditary choroidal atrophy disease were also ruled out. She did not have myopia and there was no history of trauma. So she was prescribed a STOS therapy of vitamin D deficiency, 6 lakhs units IM and 200 units daily along with calcium supplementation. She was giving a cycloplegic refraction of plus 0.5 D diopter spheres in both eyes by us. And she was advised a follow-up visit after 3 months. So patient was followed up by teleconsultation due to the second wave of COVID-19. It was confirmed that there was significant improvement in her complaints of vitamin D deficiency, like limping, difficulty in getting up from ground, weakness in thighs and legs. And there was also no recurrence of headache on regular usage of her prescription classes. So coming to discussion, vitamin D is mainly obtained from the sunlight exposure as most of the dietary sources are poor. India, despite being a sun-rich country, has demonstrated rampant vitamin D deficiency across all age groups. So vitamin D deficiency is one of the most important health problems with its increasing prevalence among women, and the worldwide prevalence ranges from 6 to 68%, whereas in India it is almost 70 to 100%. So vitamin D has a wide spectrum of actions in bone health and calcium homeostasis. Rickets in children and osteomalacia in adults are the most striking features of its deficiency. And vitamin D receptors have been shown to be expressed in retinal, vascular, and choroidal endothelial cells. So vitamin D concentration is measured using the serum 25OH-D levels, and more than 20 are considered sufficient. Less than 20, that is 12 to 20 are insufficient, and less than 12 are deficient. So in our case study, we found a chorioretinal atrophic patch using the EDI SDOCT, whereas the normative database given by Chablani showed that the maximum choroidal thickness was found at subfoveal choroid and temporal choroid was thicker than nasal choroid. So vitamin D is a potent inhibitor of endothelial cell sprouting, elongation, and proliferation. It also inhibits the replication of vascular smooth muscle cells and reduces vascular mitogenic response to stimulative factors. Diabetic retinopathy as well as age-related macular degeneration are two important diseases that are known to have a relationship with vitamin D deficiency. So choroidal thinning should be considered as a potential mechanism in vitamin D associated pathogenesis for this disease. So conclusion, we reported a unilateral choroidal atrophy in a vitamin D deficient patient, which was not affecting her vision. So a complete ophthalmic examination, including OCT, should be done in all cases of vitamin D deficient patients to rule out any choroidal and retinal changes due to its deficiency. And studies in larger groups should also be conducted so that choroidal and retinal changes due to vitamin D deficiency and their possible role in pathogenesis of various retinal and choroidal pathologies can be elucidated. These are my references. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammad Ilyas Gori. Only point thing is it is a unilateral presentation, as you said, only in one eye.
Yes, sir. Right eye was normal.
Right eye is absolutely normal, so only one eye.
Yes.
We need to rule out other causes of the chorioretinal atrophy as well.
Yes, sir. We ruled out the most common was infection, so we ruled out torch infection by history and by serologies.
So Venkatraman, Raman sir.
Yeah. What you rightly pointed out, it is a unilateral.
Yeah.
And we cannot draw any conclusions based on this one study and one eye. That one eye doesn't look appropriate.
Correct.
To come to conclusion.
Yes. Dr. Raman sir, you have any conclusions?
Yeah. My question is, after the treatment, he received vitamin D treatment. No? So
Yes.
after 3 months, any OCT was repeated or the changes were reversible? I want to know.
Sir, her vitamin D deficient
it is-
symptoms, which they were significantly improved, sir.
No, symptoms improved. What
Yes,
about
sir.
the retinal picture on
Sir,
OCT?
sir, it was the peak of second wave, sir. The patients, attenders were apprehensive to come to our hospital, so we couldn't follow up. We are still trying, and if they come, we'll surely do a.
I think that would be better if we get
Yeah.
opportunity. To
Maybe
repeat
if
it and,
you follow up the
see that.
patient and do the OCT again and compare, that would be a good experience.
Yes, sir.
Okay, anyway, nice presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammad Ilyas Gori.
Thank
So
you, sir.
we would go to the next presenter by Dr. Vupuluru Gautami. It is on effect of prematurity on foveal development in early school age children. Dr. Gautami, over to you.
Dr. Gautami, could you please start sharing your screen? Perfect.
Good morning, everyone. My topic is on effect of prematurity on foveal development in early school age children who have not received this retinopathy of prematurity treatment. Introduction. Fovea is the central portion of macula in human retina, which is critical for high visual acuity and color vision. Its early development begins at fetal week 12 and continues into childhood. So at birth, peripheral retinal vascularization has not been completed in premature infants, which may later show the features of incomplete peripheral retinal vascularization and macular region underdevelopment, which includes shallow foveal pit, persistence of inner retinal layers, and thin outer retinal layers. My aim is to evaluate the effect of prematurity and gestational age on morphological and vascular development of fovea and parafovea. My study is a retrospective cohort study. My sample size is 90, which is divided into 3 groups. Of group 1, which includes gestational age less than 30 weeks. Group 2 includes 31 to 34 weeks of gestation. And group 3 includes full-term infants. My inclusion criteria includes the best corrected visual acuity 6/6 and the infants who had not received any retinopathy treatment, and the children who are able to fixate the light target and to maintain the stable head position during image capture, and the opposite are all excluded, including ocular medial opacities like cataract and corneal opacities. And the data is collected from each patient, like best corrected visual acuity, axial length measurement, anterior and posterior segment examination for the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And the main study indicates this OCT measurements and OCT angiography. My OCT measurements are taken at the following areas of 1 into 1 mm circle on the fovea and 3 into 3 mm annulus in the parafoveal region. The retinal thickness measurements taken were central foveal thickness, inner retinal thickness and outer retinal thickness, and the choroidal thickness in the subfoveal region, nasal and temporal regions. OCT angiography measurements were taken at foveal avascular zone and the vascular densities, which include superficial capillary plexus and deep capillary plexus, and the flow area in the outer retinal and choriocapillaris layer. This picture A, in the green line in the picture A, indicates the demarcation between outer retina and inner retina. Picture B indicates the subfoveal thickness, choroidal thickness, nasal and temporal choroidal thickness. Picture C indicates the superficial vascularization, and D indicates deep vascularization. The left side pictures A to E are the full-term infant patients, and the F to J are the premature infants, which shows the significant increase in the foveal thickness. My results are compared between all the 3 groups, and which shows a negative correlation between the gestational age and central foveal thickness, outer retinal thickness, inner retinal thickness, parafoveal nasal, foveal superficial capillary plexus vascular density, foveal deep capillary plexus vascular density, and a positive correlation between gestational age and subfoveal choroidal thickness, nasal choroidal thickness, and temporal choroidal thickness. Macular development begins at approximately 24 weeks of gestational age. The foveal pit begins to develop at 24 to 27 weeks. This preterm birth causes a failure of inner retinal layers to migrate away from the fovea and an elevated outer nuclear ratio. The outer retina is known to consume large amounts of oxygen. Therefore, the choroid supplies increased blood flow to the outer retina. In our study, temporal choroidal thickness was significantly thinner in the early school-age children who were born prematurely compared to those who were born full term. Vascular endothelial growth factor plays an important role in the growth of retinal vessels into the fovea, but angiotensin inhibits the vascular growth. There will be a perfect balance between these two. When this balance gets disrupted, this vascular endothelial growth factor, when this balance gets disturbed, it will result in the decrease in the foveal avascular zone diameter. Conclusion, OCT and OCT angiography are very useful non-invasive method to evaluate the morphology and vasculature of the fovea and parafoveal in early school-age children who were born prematurely. And even if the fundus examination appears normal, morphological and vascular differences may exist between the fovea and parafoveal in the early school-age children. And the differences are more pronounced in the fovea compared with the parafoveal. And further studies with larger sample will be need to understand the clinical significance of structural and vascular characteristics in the fovea of untreated prematurely born children. These are my references. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gautami. So only thing is, how many patients you have studied? How many children?
Only 45 children, sir, but each eye is taken as individual samples.
And what was the age group of all these
Age
patients?
group is 12 to 14 years. Sir.
12 to 14 years. So you have retrospectively asked about the premature history and then you have taken the OCTs.
Yes, sir.
I think the sample size, and if it is big number, then we can get good conclusion results.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So Dr. Venkatratnam, sir, any questions to her?
Gautami, how do you get the history from the parents or teachers? History.
From the parents, sir.
Parents.
And also the records which were there.
Which records? Hospital records?
Yes, sir.
Delivery
No,
records?
sir.
No.
Yes, sir. The patient's records, sir, at the time of delivery, who were born premature and didn't receive any retinopathy of prematurity treatment, sir.
Oh. But
So
still,
means
skeptical about the way you collected the history. 14 years after delivery.
Correct. It is strange to
even children, even parents also, it is difficult to remember and tell you. Unless you have a retrospective study going into the hospital and finding the records of the delivery and how it was happened, what is the neonatal period and all that. But of course, you did a good study. You tried a good for a cause. Right. The authenticity will increase if you get more numbers, as boss already pointed out.
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
Yes, sir. Actually, it's a good attempt. Good attempt. Okay. Small answers. Nice attempt. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Gautami. So next presentation is by Dr. Vitala Manasa. That's on serum C-reactive protein level in age-related macular degeneration. Dr. Manasa, you can start the presentation.
Yes, sir. Good morning. My topic is serum C-reactive protein level in age-related macular degeneration patient. Introduction. Age-related macular degeneration is the most common form of legal blindness. Globally, it ranks third as a cause of blindness after cataract and glaucoma, according to WHO. ARMD is a degenerative disorder affecting macula characterized by presence of specific clinical findings, including bruising and RPE changes. Classification. Dry ARMD is the most common form, comprised of bruising. Geographic atrophy is the advanced stage. Wet ARMD includes choroidal neovascularization, pigment epithelial detachment, retinal angiomatous proliferation, and polypoidal choroidal vasculopathy are the additional conditions added to wet ARMD in the recent times. Recent evidence suggests that inflammation and abnormalities of innate immunity play a role in pathogenesis of ARMD. Accumulation of extracellular debris beneath the retina, which may be related to the upregulation of immunoinflammatory responses, may be and the development of ARMD. In the case of neovascular ARMD, this process involves an overt inflammatory or neovascular response originating from the choroidal vasculature. Aims and objectives included to study the association between ARMD and serum C-reactive protein levels. Methodology, The study population comprised of ARMD patients aged 50 years and older, fulfilling the inclusion criteria that visited our institution during the study period for their eye ailments. It was a descriptive type of study. Inclusion criteria: all clinically diagnosed ARMD patients of more than 50 years of age. Exclusion criteria: ARMD patients on prior treatment, that is antioxidants and anti-VEGF. ARMD patients with other retinal diseases affecting macula. ARMD patients with diagnosed hepatic disease and with a history of any inflammatory disease presently or 3 to 4 days in the past. My results showed age distribution. Majority of the cases of early ARMD are in 60 to 65 years, while proportion of the patients with late ARMD increases as age advances, as depicted in the above figure. Gender distribution showed ARMD is more prevalent in females. Serum C-reactive protein and ARMD relationship showed only 6 out of 25 patients and 5, that is 33% of 15 patients of late ARMD showed a positive serum C-reactive protein levels, that is more than 6 mg per liter, and this is statistically not significant, that is p-value was more than 0.05. When I did BCVA for these ARMD patients, majority of the patients with early ARMD have vision of 6/6 to 6/12, and majority of the patients with late ARMD have vision 6/60 and less than 6/60. Patients with less than 6/60 correspond to 16% of all the ARMD patients. Metamorphopsia and ARMD relationship showed only patients having late ARMD have metamorphopsia, and result was highly significant. To summarize, 40 patients of ARMD who satisfy the inclusion and exclusion criteria were included by non-random purposive sampling method. Then detailed case history, including personal and family history, was taken. The study patient at presentation was subjected to comprehensive systemic and ocular examination, include visual acuity, refractive status, slit lamp biomicroscopy using 90D was done. Other relevant investigations like FFA was done, where no typical geographic atrophic pattern was seen, and also in cases of wet ARMD patients. Eye having ARMD changes in both eyes. Eye having more ARMD changes of 2 eyes was used for analysis. Serum C-reactive protein levels were assessed by latex agglutination by Serocheck AGA PPE kit, having analytical sensitivity as 6 mg per liter. Most of the study patients with early and as well as late ARMD changes have serum C-reactive levels below the 6 mg per liter, that is below reference value taken in the study. So to conclude, there wasn't any statistical significance between the serum C-reactive protein levels and ARMD, that is serum CRP was below 6 mg per liter, which is so this was because this may be due to the fact that retina makes up extremely smaller part of the body, and that proportion involved in ARMD is even smaller. The local inflammatory reaction reported to exist therein by the laboratory studies would not be expected to create a detectable levels of acute phase reactants in the peripheral blood. Moreover, the blood retinal barrier may also play a role in restricting the detection of markers of inflammation in the peripheral circulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Manasa. So, but what is the take-home message? What is the benefit of doing a serum reactive protein in patients with ARMD?
So, sir, I thought if it was significant, we would have given them any other inflammatory drugs to treat ARMD. So, but it turned out to be less, like serum reactive protein did not show any significant elevation in ARMD patients.
Okay. Dr. Ratnam sir, do you have any questions for Dr.
No questions. She did a very good trial to see the relationship, but she could not able to come to any positive correlation.
Yeah.
Okay, good day. Manasa.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Dr. Raman sir, do you have any questions for her?
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah. So we'll go to the next presentation by Dr. Nakka Shivakumar Yadav. He's going to present on a retrospective study of ocular manifestation in, it is by Dr. Punna Manasa. There are two Manasas. So the next presenter is by Dr. Punna Manasa. She would be presenting on knowledge, attitude, and practice of diabetic retinopathy amongst the diabetic patients.
Good morning. My topic is knowledge, attitude, and practice of diabetic retinopathy among the diabetic patients. Diabetes mellitus, being a global epidemic, is estimated to affect 439 million people by the year 2030 in the world, and this increase is disproportionate, with more in developing countries. Studies carried out in India over the last decade reported that diabetic retinopathy prevalence was approximately 9.6% in rural area and 18% in the urban areas. The awareness both diabetics and the diabetic care providers. Only one of the paramedics and 1/10 of the people from the community aware that uncontrolled diabetes was a risk factor for retinopathy. A systemic review study by Mappa et al. Has reported that lack of knowledge, lack of awareness, low educational attainment, and poor literacy, symptomatic nature of diabetic retinopathy, financial barriers, and protection are major needs at common level barriers. Accessibility issue related with appointment, lack of resources, knowledge, and awareness among providers, screening infrastructure, cost of the services, and deficiencies in education presented as major barriers. It is not unusual to detect the sight-threatening retinopathy in people with diabetes at their first eye examination. Hence, early screening is required before the symptoms develop. The advantage of engaging village health workers as health educators in diabetic retinopathy has been demonstrated in few studies.
I think Punna Manasa doctors.
Dr. Manasa, can you hear us? Dr. Puna Manasa, can you hear us?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah,
I think there is some connectivity issue. We cannot see your screen.
Okay.
Can you please start sharing again? Dr. Manasa, can you hear us?
Yes, ma'am. I'm connecting again, ma'am.
Sure.
Can you see, ma'am, now?
Not yet.
You have to share the screen.
Can you see the green icon start sharing screen at the bottom of your Zoom platform? Yes, Dr. Manasa, we can can see your screen now. Dr. Manasa, can you hear us?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, you can make it full screen and then start.
Yes. Now it's okay, sir?
Yeah, fine. You can go ahead now.
Self-efficacy is a direct predictor of health behavior according to the social cognitive theory and self-efficacy theory. There are 4 main sources of self-efficacy that include successful performance accomplishment, vicarious experience, verbal persuasion, and psychological cues. Intervention through multimedia has shown to increase knowledge about but not acceptance of comprehensive eye examination, although making examination free has shown increased acceptance. My aims and objectives are primary objective to analyze the knowledge, attitude, and practice pattern in participants by using a questionnaire. Secondary objective to identify the perceived barriers in diabetic retinopathy screening. Materials and methods, a prospective consecutive non-randomized pre-tested self-administered questionnaire-based intervention study was done in type 2 diabetics in Pratima Institute of Medical Sciences. A validated bilingual questionnaire was administered having 5 knowledge, 4 attitude, and 5 practice-related questions. Results total 104 eligible diabetics that includes 58 males and 46 females were participated in the study. Demographic data is listed as age distribution, education status, duration of diabetes. 94 participants were taking diabetes medication as advised by the physician. 17 participants had done retinopathy checkup at the time of diagnosis of diabetes. 10 had never undergone diabetic retinopathy screening. 87 consulted ophthalmologists, while rest took treatment from optometrist, pharmacist, and general physician for the eye conditions. 66 followed ophthalmologist advice for regular eye checkups. 104 participants had received some form of the eye care. Barriers identified in participants were listed in the table. This is the table showing the questionnaire which I used in my study. This is the table showing age distribution of the participants. 36.5% of the participants were of age group 51 to 60 years. This is a table showing education status. 52.90% were of the education status of high school and below. Duration of diabetes, most of the patients were of 35.6% of the patients were of duration 1 year to 5 years. This is the table of analysis of the responses which I got from my study. Sources of information of the participants who are aware of diabetic eye disease. Most of the patients were got to know about the diabetic eye disease from ophthalmologist. Barriers identified were lack of accessibility, affordability, lack of health information, family support, and health issues. Most of them were lack of affordability and lack of health information. This is a pie diagram showing the age distribution, education status, duration of diabetes of the participants, and sources of information. Discussion: health promotion aims at attitude and behavior change for healthy life. Impact of any health promotion activity can be caused by knowledge, attitude, and behavior changes analysis. Clinical research has revealed that poor health literacy is consistently associated with poor outcome. Questionnaire identified 52.95% of the participants were aware of the recommendation for annual screening. 38.5% were aware of the effect of poor control and duration of diabetic retinopathy. Practice pattern in study participants showed reasonably good trend among the urban population to seek qualified healthcare, although barriers identified. Study re-emphasized the importance of planning more number of community-oriented screening programs coupled with target health promotion activities. Although it is a conclusion, good knowledge about the disease was significantly associated with positive attitude and good practice pattern. Knowledge about the diabetic retinopathy was poor among the patients in our study. Lack of awareness concerning the need for screening for retinopathy was a major barrier to regular screening. There is an urgent need to educate the diabetic patients about this potentially blinding complication of diabetes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Manasa. This is very important because the awareness amongst the public is very less regarding the diabetic retinopathy. In the early stages, if we can screen them and educate them so that they'll be aware of the complications of vision loss due to diabetic retinopathy.
Yes, sir.
Ratnam, sir, you have any questions?
What you told is right. We need only a lot of population education regarding so many health aspects. Among them, the diabetes is one of the important issues. But
Raman, sir, you have any questions?
Yeah, it's a good study. That's nice. We'll go ahead with it.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Manasa. So next presenter is Dr. Nakka Shivakumar Yadav. He would be presenting on a retrospective study of ocular manifestation in profile of brain tumors in a tertiary eye care institute. Dr. Shivakumar, over to you.
Good morning.
Good morning. You can share the screen.
Good morning, everyone. Today my topic is to study the ocular manifestations in the profile of brain tumor in a tertiary eye care institute, a retrospective study. A primary brain tumor is one of the most common and important reasons for neurological and ophthalmological consultation worldwide. The clinical signs and symptoms and management of this tumor depends on the site, type, and duration of the tumor. The clinical features are related to mass effect, phase, intracranial tension, expression or suppression of various hormones by the tumors or due to the hydrocephalus. These clinical presentations are caused due to the involvement of the visual pathway, including cranial nerve, attacks, and the cranial nucleus. Ophthalmic signs and symptoms include vision loss, optic changes. About 60% of these patients with brain tumor present first to an ophthalmologist with ocular complaints. This study was conducted at Department of Ophthalmology, Chalmara Andhra Institute of Medical Sciences from September 2022 to March 2021 after approval by the Institutional Ethics Committee. Medical records of each patient were reviewed. A detailed history was taken from the patient as well as from the attendant. 10 patients fulfilling the inclusion and exclusion criteria here included in the study. All the patients were subjected to detailed systemic and ophthalmic evaluation, like onset, duration, and progression of symptoms such as blurring of vision, eye pain, headache, with or without aura, vomiting, history of illness, hypertension, diabetes mellitus, ischemic heart disease, asthma, tuberculosis, substance abuse, other medications, and infection were noted. The detailed ophthalmological examination was done, including the assessment of uncorrected visual acuity, pinhole vision, best corrected visual acuity, pupil examination for the RAPD, and color vision test. Slit lamp examination of anti-segment was done. Posterior segment was examined using slit lamp with 90D lens and using indirect ophthalmoscope with 20D lens. Intraocular pressure was measured by Goldman applanation chronometry. All cranial nerves were systemically examined. Central nervous system examination was performed by checking for the orientation and short and long-term memory. The tone in the muscles and reflexes were elicited. Coordination was tested using the finger nose test and digitokinesis. Sensations were checked using the pinprick test, temperature sense, vibration sense, and joint and position sense. Fundus and optic disc photography was done. Automated perimetry was done for the visual field defect. Visual evoked potential was done to confirm the clinical diagnosis and ascertain the site of lesion. Magnetic resonance imaging of brain and orbit was performed. A total of patients were evaluated in this study and following assessments were performed. Age distribution, total patients enrolled in this study is 10. Majority of patients in this study were in the age group of 51 to 70 years. The oldest patient was 68 years and the youngest was 31 years. Sex distribution in the study, there was a slight female preponderance, females accounting for 70% of the patients, majority of them were 51 to 60 years age group. Visual acuity of the bird's eye was taken into account. The visual acuity was poor in most of the patients at the time of presentation, that is 6/36 or less than 70% of the patients. 20% of patients had visual acuity of 6/6 to 6/12, and 10% had a visual acuity between the 6/12 and 6/36. The patient presented with the wide variety of symptoms. All patients presented with diminution of vision. The second most common presentation was headache, present in 40% of the patients, followed by the vertigo in 20%, vomiting and tinnitus in 20% of the patients each. 10% patients present with the diplopia, facial swelling, epistaxis, arthritis, pallor, and ptosis each. The most common ocular sign which was observed was optic disc atrophy seen in 40% of the patients. Optic disc pallor was seen in 20% and vascular in the 10% of the patients. Retinal pigment epithelial defects in 10% of the patients. 10% of patients show the restriction of extraocular movement. RAPD was seen in 40% of the patients at the time of presentation. 20% of patients had defective color vision at the time of presentation. Visual field defect at the time of presentation. This is the pie chart showing the type of brain tumor found in the study. Quadrantopia was seen in 10% of patients, while 70% has the bilateral hemianopia and homonymous hemianopia in 10%. 10% had a 3-quadrant visual field loss. Meningioma was the most common tumor observed in this study with a prevalence of 40%. The next most common tumor encountered was pituitary macroadenoma, which was seen in 30% of patients. Cranial carcinoma seen in 20% of the patients. Intracranial space of was seen in 10% of the patients. Discussion. Studies have shown that 80% of the primary brain tumors occur in adults age group. Primary brain tumors are the second most common solid tumor in the children. Approximately 70% of the brain tumors have glial cell origin, whereas 50% of them origin from the meninges. The location of the brain tumors varies with age. In adults, 70% are supratentorial, whereas in children, 20% are infratentorial. Among the neurological diseases, intracranial tumors are the second most common cause of the death, first being the cerebrovascular accident. In developing countries, these patients usually present very late, the severe to complete visual loss from the optic atrophy. About 50% of patients who are diagnosed with primary brain tumors initially present with ophthalmic signs and symptoms. In developing countries, these patients usually present very
Dr.
late.
Shivkumar, you can just sum up and conclude.
Okay. Ocular features can be considered as a window through which we can detect brain lesions. Early detection of the brain tumor through ocular signs and symptoms can help in early diagnosis and appropriate management. All the patients presenting with diminution of vision and with fundus findings must undergo visual field examination. MRI must be performed in doubtful cases to delineate the exact anatomical location and diagnosis of the lesion. Prognosis of the patient is much better if the lesion is detected early and treated appropriately. Thus, ophthalmologists play an important role in saving the life and vision of these patients.
Thank you, Dr. Shivkumar. So you have nicely summarized that the importance of ophthalmological examination in evaluating and picking up these neurological conditions. And as you rightly mentioned, that radio imaging is also plays a key role in early identification of these lesions. So, Dr. Ratnam, sir, you have any questions to Dr. Shivkumar?
No questions.
Dr. Raman, sir?
One question, Shivkumar. What was the earliest visual complaint the patients are having? See, this retrospective study, only 10 patients now.
Yeah.
Actually, US is a big institute. You could have taken a lot of records, isn't it? And what was the earliest visual?
No. Shivkumar, what was the earliest presenting manifestation or symptoms?
Diminution of vision, headache.
Okay, so sir was telling that if it is, as it is a retrospective study, you can have good number of patients so that the results will be more evident.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Shivkumar. So we'll out of time, we'll just go to the next presenter. That is Dr. Afreen Ahmadi Khatun. So Dr. Afreen would be presenting on preseptal cellulitis as a complication of a routine COVID-19 nasopharyngeal swab.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Afreen, you can start
Yes,
sharing the screen and present.
Yes, sir. Good morning, everyone. My topic is preseptal cellulitis as a complication of routine COVID-19 nasopharyngeal swab. To report purpose is to report a case of preseptal cellulitis as a complication of routine COVID-19 nasopharyngeal swab test for RT-PCR. Chief complaints: a 50-year-old female presented to the outpatient department of ophthalmology with the complaints of swelling around the right eye since 2 days and pain around the right eye since 2 days. Patient was apparently asymptomatic 1 week back. Then she developed am I audible, sir?
Yes, you are audible. You can.
Patient was asymptomatic 1 week back. Then she developed mild fever and body pains, for which she underwent routine nasopharyngeal swab testing for COVID-19 RT-PCR at local government hospital. 4 days later, she developed swelling around the right eye, which was diffuse and gradually increased in size and was associated with pain. Past history: no similar complaints in the past. No history of ocular trauma or previous ocular surgeries. Not a known case of diabetes, hypertension, or bronchial asthma, tuberculosis, or HIV. Not a known case of thyroid eye disease. Family history nil significant. Ocular examination. General examination: patient was conscious, coherent, cooperative, and oriented. No pallor, icterus cyanosis, or clubbing, lymphadenopathy, or pedal edema was noted. Temperature was 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit, and pulse rate 92 beats per minute regular. Respiratory rate 22 per minute. Systemic examination was within normal limits. Ocular examination: head posture, no compensatory head posture. Facial symmetry asymmetrical due to right eyelid swelling. Ocular symmetry was normal. Extraocular movements were normal. Coming to visual acuity in both the eyes was 618. Color vision was normal. Rho+ was negative. Lids right eye, diffuse firm swelling and erythema of total upper and lower eyelid. Tenderness was present at the orbital margins. Conjunctiva acquired in both eyes. Cornea was clear and anterior segment was normal. Iris normal, pupil normal reaction. Lens nuclear sclerosis grade 1 in both eyes. Fundus was within normal limits. IOP could not be elicited because of the swelling and pain, and in left eye it was normal. This is the patient. Investigation, patient was sent for ENT examination. On examination, there was right ethmoidal tenderness, and also diagnostic nasal endoscopy was done. So it revealed the retained fragment of the swab at the level of the middle turbinate and lateral wall of the nose, which was removed immediately with the forceps and sent for microbiological examination. X-ray paranasal sinuses was advised, which shows right-sided ethmoidal sinusitis. Patient was advised CT scan of the orbit, but she denied. And diagnosis is right lid preceptal cellulitis due to retained nasopharyngeal swab in the right nasal cavity. Management, patient was started immediately on broad spectrum antibiotics. That is, she was given tablet amoxicillin and plus clavulanic acid twice daily, along with paracetamol twice daily, and ciprofloxacin eye ointment for external application on the eyelids. And she was advised to review after 3 days. There was marked reduction in the swelling of the right eyelid 3 days after 3 days, and pain was also less. Discussion. Infection stemming from the ethmoid sinus is rapidly progressive because the lamina praepatia, which is only border between ethmoid sinus and the orbit, it is very thin with perforations and fenestrations which allow the passage of nerves and blood vessels. So this allows easy spread of infection from ethmoid sinuses to the periorbital and orbital region. Conclusion, the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in substantial rise in number of nasopharyngeal swab tests carried out worldwide. Many healthcare workers may not be aware of the potential risk of swabbing. It is of high importance to ensure the correct implementation of the swabbing in order to minimize the risk involved with that. And these are the CDC guidelines for correct nasopharyngeal swabbing. Patient's head is tilted to 70 degrees and gently insert the swab through the nostril parallel to the palate until resistance is encountered. Gently rub and roll the swab and slowly remove the swab. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Afreen. Dr. Ratnam sir, you have any questions for
very good point she made through her presentation. And even I am not aware that the swab will be left in the nasal patients when testing for the COVID. Very good.
Nice idea. Nice input.
Maybe sometimes the loose tip of the Q-tip can also cause this.
Yes.
Anyway, nice presentation, Dr. Afreen. So next presenter is Dr. Sikuri Divyajyoti. She would be presenting a clinical study on ocular manifestations in leprosy.
Good morning, sir. Okay, sir.
You can start, share your screen and then.
Yes, sir. Okay, sir. Good morning, sir. Today's my title is Clinical Study on Ocular Manifestations in Leprosy. Coming to the introduction, leprosy or Hansen's disease is a chronic infectious disease caused by an intracellular rod-shaped acid-fast bacilli, Mycobacterium leprae, which affects the skin, nasal mucosa, peripheral nerves, and anterior segment of the eye. Mycobacterium leprae was discovered by Norwegian physician G. Armor Hansen in the year 1874, and leprosy can occur in all ages and both sexes. Leprosy bacilli have predilection for neural tissue, and the target is secondary to the involvement of branches of facial nerve, which presents with paralytic lagophthalmos, exposure keratitis, and neurotrophic keratitis. Acute iridocyclitis and scleritis are seen in type 2 lepra reaction occurring in lepromatous leprosy. Blindness has been reported approximately 7% of patients, secondly to lagophthalmos, uveitis, exposure keratitis, and cataract. Proper attention and early detection can prevent potentially sight-threatening lesions. Main objective of this study is to identify the ocular manifestations in leprosy in tertiary care hospital. Purpose: the study of the ocular involvement in leprosy is in relation to demographic patterns, materials, and methods. Type of study: a cross-sectional descriptive study. Source of data: outpatient department of ophthalmology and inpatient department of dermatology at Mamta Medical College and Hospital. from April 2020 to April 2021. Sample size 24 patients. Inclusion criteria: all diagnosed cases of leprosy, old and new cases, both genders and age groups of 15 years and above. Exclusion criteria: non-compliant patients and patients with pre-existing ocular disorders due to other causes other than leprosy. Procedure: relevant details of both ocular and systemic history, including details of lepra reaction and clinical examination of the patients, were recorded. A detailed slit lamp examination of anterior segment was done. Visual acuity was recorded with the help of Sneller's chart. Corneal sensations were checked with the wisp of cotton. IOP was recorded with the help of Schiot's tonometer. Fundus examination that was done with 90D, and lab investigations like semogram, ESR, routine RBS, and urine examination were done. Slit skin smear and skin biopsy from the earlobes were performed by dermatologists and report obtained as positive for Mycobacterium leprae. Results: as a leprosy is a chronic disease, an attempt is made to study the significance of duration of the disease in relation to incident of ocular involvement. For this purpose, I've divided all the patients into 3 groups. Group A being duration less than 5 years, Group B duration between 5 to 10 years, and Group C more than 10 years. In Group A, out of 4 patients, 2 patients were showed ocular involvement, percentage being 50%. In Group B, it came around 62.5%, and Group C around 66.6% patients showed ocular evidence. This is a table showing the ocular lesions distribution in study population according to age. And this is a table showing ocular lesion distribution according to the gender, males being around 73% and females 26%. This is a table showing ocular lesions involved, starting with the loss of eyebrows. Loss of eyebrows more predominant in lepromatous leprosy, around 66%, followed by borderline 50%, rare in tubercular type. Foliasis is found to be comparatively rarer. It was only found in lepromatous leprosy. Madarosis is common. It's seen in 60% of lepromatous leprosy and 33% of borderline. Trichiosis is not very common. Lagoptosis is surprisingly found to be rare in lepromatous leprosy, around 13.3%, found to be more common in tubercular leprosy. Two patients have shown the lagophthalmosis here. Picture showing madarosis and loss of eyebrows. Corneal involvement is frequent and is an important cause of visual impairment in leprosy disease. The different forms of corneal involvement are superficial punctate keratitis, subepithelial keratitis, interstitial keratitis, pannus. Of all the corneal lesions, punctate keratitis is the commonest corneal involvement. Around 42.3% of total cases have shown the superficial punctate keratitis. Picture showing superficial punctate keratitis with cobalt blue filter. Corneal opacity around 13.3%. Pannus is seen around 33.3% of patients. Exposure keratitis around 26%. Anterior uveitis, chronic anterior uveitis is seen in 8 cases of all leprosy patients, constituting 33.3%. Cataract, complicated cataract ranging from the increase of small size without causing much visual disability to total lenticular opacities leading to visual blindness are found. Out of all the 24 patients, 5 patients had cataract. Out of those 5, 2 are from lepromatous leprosy and 2 has shown as bilateral cataract. Lacrimal secretion, a study of amount of lacrimal secretion is carried out by Schwimmer's test. This is a table showing the distribution of cases with a reduction in secretion. It is found that of a total 7 patients had reduced secretion of the tears. Incidence of dry eye a maximum in lepromatous leprosy and least in tuberculosis. Discussion, we were taken most of the others and 2 patients are below the 20 years and there is no significant difference in the age distribution. Coming to my conclusion, ocular involvement in Hansen's disease is very common. 62.5% of all types of leprosy showed evidence of involvement of the eye. Duration of the disease has important bearing on incidence of ocular involvement. So highest in the as the duration increases, incidence of ocular involvement was increasing from 50% in less than 5 years to around 66% of more than 10 years. My references. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Divya. So, Ratnam sir, you have any questions for Dr. Divya?
No questions, Baju. She did very well. And all very well known findings what she brought. And she has not mentioned anything about the granulomatous uveitis. Any case? Have you come across?
No, sir. I've seen the uveitis like iridocyclitis and not.
Only iridocyclitis, not granulomatous.
Yes, sir.
The incidence of dry eye.
Sir?
Divya, what is the incidence of dry eye you found in your study?
Around 60%.
Incidence of dry eye.
Dry eye around 60%, sir. 60. More common in lepromatous leprosy, sir.
Yeah.
Anyways, thank you, Dr. Divya, for the nice presentation. So next and the last presenter is Dr. Tejaswini Padmanabula. She would be presenting on ocular manifestations in post-COVID-19 patients. Dr. Tejaswini, over to you.
Good morning, sir. Today my topic is, today my study is ocular manifestations in post-COVID-19 patients. Severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, that is SARS-CoV-2, has been responsible for coronavirus disease and has caused morbidity and mortality and are presented globally. As the population of patients recovering for COVID-19 grows, it is paramount to establish an understanding of the healthcare issues surrounding them. Apart from severe systemic disease, various ophthalmic manifestations have been reported during and following the infection of SARS-CoV-2. The main objective is to study the ocular manifestations in post-COVID-19 patients. Materials and methodology. A total of 200 patients aged between 18 and 60 with a history of COVID-19 infection within a span of 8 weeks have participated in the study. Permission was obtained from Ethical Committee of the Institute, and informed consent was obtained from subjects willing to participate in the study. All subjects underwent baseline examination to rule out any abnormality in the eyes. Relevant ocular history and systemic history was taken. Unaided, aided, and pinhole visual acuity was recorded. Refraction was performed. Slit lamp evaluation was done to rule out any anterior segment abnormality. Fundus examination was done. Relevant investigations like optical coherence tomography and fundus fluorescent angiography were done. All relevant systemic and radiological investigations were done. Results. In this study, 200 patients were examined for the evaluation of post-COVID-19 ocular manifestations, and following assessments were performed. 23 out of 200, that is 122 being male and 78 female patients with the history of COVID-19 infection had ocular manifestations. Age and gender distribution. The patients were grouped into age groups of 18 to 30, 30 to 40, 40 to 50, and 50 to 60. Patients in all age group are almost equally affected. There was a slight male preponderance. The patients mainly presented with the symptoms of headache, pain, conjunctival congestion, discharge, photophobia, watering, lid swelling, drooping of eyelid, and a sudden painless diminution of vision in 2 patients and gradual progressive painless diminution of vision in 1 patient. The signs which we elicited were follicles, papillae, and lid margin erosions in few, meibomian gland dysfunction, and engorged episcleral vessels, ptosis, and fundus findings which we elicited were retinal pallor, papilledema in a patient, cotton wool spots, preretinal hemorrhage, cherry red spot, serous detachment of macula in a patient, and delayed arterial filling in fundus fluorescent angiography in 2 patients. The patients had following comorbidities like hypertension, diabetes mellitus, CVA, CAD, rheumatoid arthritis, obesity. The types of ocular manifestations found in the study were 2 patients had central retinal artery occlusion, 1 patient had central serous choroidal retinopathy, 2 patients were rhino-orbitocerebral mucormycosis suspects, and 15 patients were diagnosed with conjunctivitis, and 3 patients were diagnosed with episcleritis. Coming to the discussion, in our study, 23, that is 11.5% out of 200 patients had COVID-19 related manifestations. Age and gender distribution, patients in all age groups are almost equally affected, while there is a slight male preponderance with male to female ratio of 1.56, which is slightly lesser than the study conducted by Dr. Sindhuja. Symptoms, most common symptoms of the patients were conjunctival congestion. Most common signs elicited were follicles and papillae. Associated comorbidities in the patients with ocular manifestations. Most patients with ocular manifestations were hypertensive and diabetic. And the type of ocular manifestations found in the study were 2 patients had central retinal artery occlusion, 1 patient had central serous choroidal retinopathy, 2 patients were rhino-orbitocerebral mucormycosis suspects, 15 patients were diagnosed with conjunctivitis, 3 patients were diagnosed with episcleritis, similar to the study conducted by Dr. Sindhuja and Dr. Nasrini. Conclusion. Follicular conjunctivitis manifesting as conjunctival condition has been common. It is one of the major ocular manifestations in post-COVID-19 positive patients, even with mild disease. CSCR is recognized complication of steroid use, and hence its association with COVID-19 is being anticipated. Rhinocerebral mucormycosis is one of the most dreaded complications of non-judicious steroid use in the management of COVID-19. Patients with COVID-19 infection are in a procoagulant state with raised D-dimer, prothrombin, activated partial thromboplastin time, interleukin-6 and cytokines, resulting in vascular occlusions like central retinal artery occlusion. And episcleritis in context of COVID-19 may include immunovascular factors or coagulation disorders. The study mainly emphasizes on ocular manifestations associated with COVID infection and its sequelae. As these patients presented with an association with COVID-19 infection, either during or recovery, ophthalmologists should be watchful and screen for such entities to prevent further complication. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Tejaswini, for a nice presentation, and you have elucidated all the various manifestations of COVID in ocular manifestations. But did you note the duration from the COVID infection to the symptoms, onset of symptoms?
Yes, sir. Mainly the duration is from almost 3 weeks to 6 weeks, sir, after COVID infection.
Another question is, see, in how many percent of patients there was a diminution of vision or sudden loss of vision?
Sudden loss of vision. Only 2 patients out of my 200.
Only 2 patients. And how many patients had the diplopia, double vision? So apart from conjunctivitis and episcleritis. Hello?
Am I audible, sir?
Your voice is breaking, Dr. Tejaswini.
Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, now you're audible.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
2 patients had sudden painless loss of vision, sir, among 200.
No. So most of the cases, once there is an epilobital extension from ethmoid sinus, so usually they come with retroviral neuritis and then extraocular muscle involvement, particularly the medial rectus involvement. So
yes, sir.
So out of 200, you had only 2 patients.
Only 2. We had only 2 patients of rhinocerebral mucormycosis, sir. One of them had a ptosis as presentation, sir.
Sir Venkatratnam, sir, you have any questions to Dr. Tejaswini?
No, you can go ahead.
So we can, I think, all the presenters, thank you for nice presentations. And thank you, Dr. Venkatratnam, sir, and Raman, sir, for chairing and co-chairing the session. So we would like to conclude and sign off the session, and before handing out to the hall to the next National Symposium one. And I think we kept the time, and we are just 4 minutes before.
Thank you, Sandeep.
Perfect.
Nice
Thank you so much, Dr. Sandeep, for keeping it on time, and excellent and insightful talks by all our speakers, and fantastically moderated by Dr. Sandeep. So before closing out the session, I would like to take the opportunity to thank all the delegates, our chairpersons and our co-chairperson. And I would request all to please switch on their camera, and we'll take a quick photograph, a virtual photograph. Okay, so maybe let's, I would request all to please unmute their lines as well. So let's hear it for all our presenters who have presented wonderfully and beautifully. So maybe let's have a huge round of applause for all our presenters for the day. Great. All right. Thank you so much. With this, we close the first session. We'll be starting with the next session in 3 minutes from now. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.